Hello, everyone, and welcome. Book Club Favorites is so excited to be hosting a joint live with our multicultural marketing team in celebration of Black History Month. Today, we are joined by two fabulous authors, as well as the VP of our multicultural marketing team, Kianna Ferris. The authors we have in conversation today are Sadeqa Johnson, the author of an immersive historical fiction tale, Yellow Wife, which is now in paperback, which follows an enslaved woman forced to barter love and freedom while living in the most infamous slave jail in Virginia. Additionally, we have Kianna Alexander here, who is the author of Carolina Built, which tells the previously untold story of Josephine N. Leary as she builds a legacy after emancipation in North Carolina. Her book comes out at the end of this month on February 22nd. And Kianna has some great questions planned for both authors today, but we would love to hear from some audience members as well. So please leave a comment or question in the section below the video, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can on screen today. So I'm going to throw it over to Kianna to start off the discussion, and away we go.
Yeah, hi, I'm Kianna, and in the Multicultural Marketing Department, we select 8 titles this season that we focus on. And it's the highlight, really, of my job when I can be in conversation with the authors of the books that are selected. And so Yellow Wife and Carolina Built are 2 of these books. And when we're picking books to focus on, we really pick these stories that really haven't been told before. And I think what really attracted me to Yellow Wife and Carolina Built are there things I had not really read about in Black historical fiction. Yes, we've read, slave stories, but it was a very unique perspective that I can't wait for Sadeqa to, talk about. And then I was really excited to read about a woman during the Reconstructionist era and what happens when once you're emancipated that, we're able to really thrive. So I'm really excited to talk about these 2 books. And so to kick it off first, I would love to have Sadeqa talk about the inspiration for her book, and then we'll have Kianna share hers. So I'll kick it off to Sadeqa.
Oh, thank you so much, Kianna. And thank you guys, everyone who is joining us today. This is a wonderful way to kick off Black History Month. As Kianna mentioned, my name is Sadeqa Johnson. I am the author of Yellow Wife. And I discovered the story of Mary Lumpkins in 2016. I was walking the Richmond Slave Trail with my friends and my family, and we really just set out on a history lesson for the kids. They took turns reading the different markers. It's about 2.5 miles to and from. It snakes along the James River. And we came along one of the markers that talked about the Lumpkins Jail. and it was described as a holding center and punishing site for enslaved people. In fact, between 1844 and 1865, over 200,000 passed through this particular jail. And the owner, he was nicknamed the bully, he was nicknamed the devil, and this was the devil's half acre. But what really drew me to the story was that it said that he was married to a Black woman. And while he was one way in business, with her, he was kind and considerate, and also with their 5 children. And right away, I just started to wonder what was life like for Mary Lumpkin. We know that women like her, they didn't have agency over their lives. And so, was this a marriage of survival? And what did she tell those 5 children every day? Because a half acre is not a lot of land, where they were witness to torture and families being separated and all of the different things that we know, the horrific experiences of slavery were right in these children's faces. And so, how did she explain it away? And that was really that nugget that kind of seeped into my skin and said, Sadeqa, pay attention. I think this is a story that needs to be told.
Sadiqa, I love hearing that, how just on a walk, and you described it so majestically that it really had you really creating this whole world. And like you said, these, women didn't have their own agency, and they had to do what they had to do to survive. And you have children, with someone who is a horrible, person. And how does that happen? I just, the way you described the narrative and the inner dialogue and what she was going through was just really, really compelling. I would love to hear from you, Kianna, and just, Josephine Leary. I had never heard of her before, and just like, how did you come across writing this?
Okay, so I'm Kianna Alexander, and my book is Carolina Built. It is about Josephine Leary, who was born into slavery in Williamston, North Carolina, in the middle of the 19th century, and she was emancipated at age 9. And during the time that she lived, she was able to amass what would today be worth about $10 million of real estate wealth, just by her own volition. She was very much self-taught and just very determined to build a legacy and to leave something behind for her daughters. So it was really a story of remarkable intelligence, perseverance, and just dogged determination to leave behind something after she was gone so that her daughters would have a more secure future.
Wow. I mean, $10 million, like that is just amazing. And just thinking about, she had been a slave at 9, and just having a new situation, a new way of living, things were able to change. And so that was really why I wanted to pair the two of you together for this live. And I thought that there would really be a great conversation, because really the trajectory of these two women's lives is really directly linked to the era that they were born in, right? We often hear as Black people, people say like we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Like, how could our great great grandparents even imagine that we're living the way that we're living? Or even, my grandmother died before Obama was president, and she always said she couldn't imagine like that there would be a Black president. So just really like when you were born, your station in life really, changes things. And so, Josephine was able to become an entrepreneur because she was emancipated, and she was living in a time, the Reconstruction era was very short, where, Black women were, and Black people were just afforded more opportunities. That was a very short window, because Jim Crow, happened right after that. And then, then we have Phoebe, a slave, who was also just trying to secure a legacy for her family. So I would just like to, for both of you, we'll start with Kianna, just really thinking about like the impact of slavery and the impact on your characters, lives and future, and within that context.
Well, I think for Josephine, having been a slave during her formative years just gave her a lot of perspective. And I think she had sort of developed these big dreams and goals for her life, mainly because she spent those first 9 years in bondage. She knew what it was like to be owned as property, and to have her humanity disregarded. So it was important to her because she knew what slavery was like. She had firsthand experience. Not only did she go through it, she went through it with her younger brother. She had a mother and her grandmother who were very pivotal in her life, who were always around to take care of her. So she saw the burden that they bore as mothers, as caretakers, taking care of their own families, even after they had to toil in the fields and do all those things that the enslaved were forced to do. And I think it really gave her a certain perspective. And I think it really motivated her. She took it as motivation. Everything that she had been through gave her the motivation she needed to achieve higher, not to just settle for a regular life. She wanted so much more for herself. She wanted so much more for her daughters and for any future generations that would come from her family line. And I think that's where it started. Those years in bondage taught her the true value of freedom and gave her the motivation to push it to its absolute limit.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of generational wealth, right? People often talking about like pick yourself up by your bootstraps, but a lot of people, they, had help in that kind of way. And so she was very, forward thinking and thinking about like how she was able to do that moving forward.
Mhm.
Sadeqa, do you want to talk about, I mean, that was a very different circumstance. She was enslaved, but just how did that circumstance, just what you're imagining, if you're thinking about the research that you're doing, even, yours is not based on, it's based on the true story, but you don't have as much of the documentation. I'm just curious.
Yeah, for Mary Lumpkin, who Yellow Wife was inspired by, what I knew about her was that she came to the Lumpkin jail as a child. So I didn't know where she came from. And so I fictionalized it and put her on a plantation so she would have to actually end up at the jail. But I know the real Mary Lumpkin actually started to have children by Robert Lumpkin at age 13, which, we know that is, I have a 13-year-old daughter right now, and that is just heartbreaking. And so she spent her life, taking care of his children and finding a way to be mixed into his business so that she had a little bit of say, but she didn't have much say. But the silver lining for the end of Mary Lumpkin's story is that when Robert Lumpkin dies, he leaves his will, and in his will, he says, I leave all of my fortune and my real estate to my yellow wife, which is where I got the title. And he meant Mary Lumpkin. And so she had a bit of wealth once he passed away. And she was able to then take the Lumpkins jail and rent it to a Baptist minister who was looking for a place to teach the enslaved people who were just free. And they came into the jail, they removed all of the bars and the whips and the chains, and they replaced it with desks and chairs. And it went from being the devil's half acre to God's half acre was the new nickname. This school changes names a few times over the decades, and then it becomes Virginia Union University, which is one of the first HBCUs in our country. And so it had a redemptive quality. And so when I knew that part of the story, I literally got goosebumps, and I knew that I had to tell this story to the best of my ability.
I'm getting goosebumps right now, like thinking about it, just to imagine that something that had such a horrible origin, and then talking about, imagining your ancestors' wildest dreams, then it's a place for education. Like it's just mind blowing. I'm getting goosebumps as well hearing that story. We have a question from Micah. As Black authors, have any of you felt the need to stick to a specific genre or topic in order for it to be received well by the public? She also says, I also can't wait to read both of your books. It motivates me as a Black aspiring author to read works by other women like myself. So I don't know if either of you.
I'll go first. For me, all of the stories, and Yellow Wife is my fourth novel. My first three novels are contemporary fiction, but I wrote about things that I knew. So my first novel was a long distance long story. Well, my husband and I, we started off long distance, so I knew what that was like. They always say that first book, that first two books really is all about you, because you're kind of taking everything that you know and everything that you've experienced and everything that you heard, and you're putting it down on paper. It's very therapeutic. therapeutic. And then by the time you get to that third novel, you're like, okay, now I can really focus on other things. And so when I got to Yellow Wife, it was like, whoa, this is completely and utterly different than anything that I could have imagined that I would write. I was a little nervous at first to make the leap from contemporary fiction to historical fiction because I was more so worried, would my fans follow me into a new genre? That was probably the biggest thing, but no one said, no, Sadeqa, you need to stick here or you need to do that. Luckily for me, I have a very supportive agent team, and they just kind of helped me to pull the best story out so that I could tell it to the best of my ability.
Kianna, do you want to talk about, because I know you have Kianna's written a lot. How many books have you written, Kianna? It's like
Carolina Build is my 41st.
Yes.
So
there's a canon right there. So.
Yeah, I've written a lot of romance, contemporary romance, historical romance, paranormal romance. I've written also some women's fiction, an essay collection about motherhood. So I've written across the gamut, different types of books. The bulk of my work has been in romance. And I started out writing romance because that was what I loved to read. I was first inspired to write by Beverly Jenkins. I really love her work. So that was just kind of where I started. But I have all kinds of stories in my mind that I want to tell. And pivoting to historical fiction was a natural move for me because history has always been something I'm really passionate about. I'm kind of a history nerd. So I knew that I would eventually make it here. My thing is that I feel like when I was mostly writing romance, there were a lot of publications and media outlets and things like that would just sort of push me off to the side and just ignore what I was doing because romance is, written largely by women for women or femme identifying people. So it kind of gets pushed to the side as not serious fiction. So that was definitely a thing, but I really didn't think too much about that. I wrote the stories that I felt like I needed to tell at the time, knowing that I would end up where I'm supposed to be. And so now this book is leading me down a different path in terms of a pivot in my career of the kinds of books I'm going to write. My voice is going to remain the same. But I have other types of stories to tell. Like I feel like I've pretty much covered the contemporary romance and things like that I've written before. So now I'm going in a new direction. But I try not to let the opinions of others dictate what I write because I feel my writing is a calling, that my job is to build empathy through fiction. And whatever type of story it is that I'm meant to tell, I'm going to tell it. And the empathy will be built with the people it's supposed to reach.
I love that because it's so hard because right now we're in the age of social media and everyone is a critic. And, I saw someone, they called it like thumb thuggery or something like that. They were calling it, right? And, it's so true. And then just to be like, you know what, I'm going to stick to what I feel is right for me. And then, audience will follow or, my passion follows. I'm not going to be dictated. I really respect that because it's hard out there, to create right now when everyone has their opinion. So I appreciate that. But going back to, because we've talked about this, especially even the title Yellow Wife, and then actually Josephine Leary she was a product of, right? She wasn't her father a master or slave master.
Yes, right? He was actually like a friend of her slave masters, an army colonel from the Confederate Army. His name was William Lamb. That was believed to be her father. She took the Williams name from the plantation for the plantation owner, but his friend Colonel Lamb was expected to is widely accepted as her father.
Yeah, and because of those experiences, colorism is such a big theme in both of the books, right? So Yellow Wife talks about, and this was something that I definitely had never heard about, these mixed race slave women, right, who were favored by the prison jailers because the white women didn't want to be associated with these people, and that the whole grooming scene, I want to hear unpack more of that. That was really, really hard to read, and also you could still have very much empathy for the characters. And then also with Josephine, being married to someone who was a different complexion than she was. And so he was able to pass and a little bit more than she was. And so, she didn't like that and how that could cause conflict. And I would just love to hear some more about those parts of the stories. And to me, that really was interesting about the husband and wife, because I come from a very large family on my grandmother's side, and everyone comes in a lot of different shades. And my grandmother was able to pass more than others. Like, she would go to the store, or try on clothes for some of her other siblings. So it's just so interesting, the dynamics of how people lived. So I would just really want to hear about this topic of colorism and how it's expressed in your works.
Yeah, for Yellow Wife, Phoebe Dolores Brown was the daughter of the master of the plantation. And I made her so because when I did the research on Mary Lumpkin, she was described as the yellow woman. She was described as very light. And so I knew that she was a mulatto girl. As I got into the research, because for me, what I knew about slavery was like roots. It happened on a plantation. There was a crazy overseer. Everybody was afraid, right? Like that was what I knew. That's the books that I read. And so it wasn't until I started to do the actual research to realize that slavery in the city looked a little bit different. There were enslaved people that were able to go and stand on the corner with a note from their masters to hire themselves out. And that there was this kind of trust system where everybody was kind of watching out. It wasn't that big, scary overseer situation. There were these very light-skinned mulatto mixed race women who were seen as such a high commodity that they were the same cost as a male field slave. And so their price was very high because they could be sold into the sex trade. And they were called fancy girls. Again, something I had not known until I started to research the story. And so these women were dressed and perfumed and prettied up so that when they went to the auction block, the price was driven up. The other thing that I discovered was that men like Robert Lumpkin were seen as the pariahs of society. And so while everybody knew, everybody dealt in enslaved people, there was this stigma around it. And so no upper crust aristocrat type of white man would marry his daughter to a man like him. And so the next best thing for them was to get a mulatto wife, an enslaved woman who could have their children. These very light-skinned children could pass, they could send them to school, and they could have that traditional sort of family that they wouldn't have been afforded otherwise.
Wow. I mean, just the whole thing, the fancy women. I definitely knew that, there was, like you said, like the house slave and, the field slaves, but the whole really dynamic in that way was just really eye-opening to me. And then Kianna, do you want to talk about your situation I really felt like the tension in their marriage was very interesting.
Mm-hmm. The interesting thing that I found during my research is that there were no photographs taken of Archer Leary, who was Josephine's husband. His nickname was Sweetie. Most people called him Sweetie. But all the handwritten notes and the records that I was able to find where people spoke about him described him as being very, very light complected, enough that he could pass for white. And Sweetie and Josephine ran a barber shop in Edenton, and it may have been beneficial to him in terms of getting clientele in a southern town that he was so light skinned. Even though she worked in the barber shop, she kind of kept to the back. She had her regular clients, kept up with the books and things like that. And he always sort of put himself forward as the owner of the barber shop, the proprietor. There was some degree of tension between them that had to do both with his tendency to pass when it was convenient for him, especially, and with her ambition, wanting to collect properties, wanting to figure out unique ways to then leverage the properties for profits that she could put towards her daughter's future. He saw that as a threat to his manhood. And faced some teasing from, his male counterparts about, who wears the pants and that sort of thing. So it caused a lot of strife between them. There were a lot of records about the sort of things that happened between them. There are, newspaper reports and things about them having a lot of altercations in relation to that. I think he just didn't know how to handle what she was trying to do. Like, it seemed that he really loved her and cared about her, but didn't know how to accept her as a person she was, being so ambitious, without feeling threatened by her.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't just facing, racism and sexism out in the street from, any person on the street. It was also in her own home, having the person that she loved sometimes work against her, when what she
Mm-hmm.
was doing was really going to benefit him and benefit their children.
Wow. Well, both very powerful stories. So, question: were there any other authors or books that really helped guide your research or writing, during the process that you can speak to?
For me, it would have been Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacob. That was my first encounter of what slavery looked like in a city. There was also another book from the bulk of my research where I really felt informed was through slave narratives. So stories where they were telling their own story. One that I found really, really helpful was 50 Years a Slave by
Mm-hmm.
Charles Ball. Also, I read Frederick Douglass and The Known World by Edward P. Jones and Winch by Dolan Perkins Valdez and The Kitchen House by Kathleen Grisham. So
Mm-hmm.
I just surrounded myself with this period of time and was constantly reading and getting a deeper understanding of what our ancestors went through.
And how about you, Kiana?
So for me, the most helpful research source was actually a booklet, based on a presentation made by a North Carolina historian. It was called The Life and Legacy of Josephine Napoleon Leary, 1856 to 1923. And it was written by Dorothy Sproul Redford, who was a historian in Somerset, North Carolina. And she published it in the mid 2000s. It was a presentation that she gave at a conference, and the whole book is about 56 pages. But she compiled so much primary source research into that book that it acted almost as a guide for me in my own research. Like, I knew exactly where to look for the things that I needed to find. So everything that she did was like primary research. So then I used that as a guide to guide my own primary research. I knew the places I need to go, what archives did I need to visit, what buildings did I need to see. It acted as a really helpful guide for me, so I could expand on the story. So she gave a lot of factual firsthand information. So now it was my job to expand on what she started.
When I hear about these letters, I feel like with email and things, we're like losing, and text, we're like losing so much. I mean, like you're able to research all these things because of letters, right? And, and like, what are we missing from our history? I'm just thinking about that. One last question before we close out. I would love to hear, especially since you're both very prolific authors, what are you both working on now? What's next for you two?
I just got my edits back, so my head is about to explode. So much to do in so little time, but I am working on another historical. So this will be my second. It's right now entitled Where the Bad Girls Go. And it is set between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. In the 1940s and the 1950s. And it deals with the themes of motherhood and sexism and colorism and socioeconomics, and really dives deep on what it really was to be a woman during that time.
Oh, I'm very excited to read that. My family's from the DC area. My grandma lived during that time. I don't know if she was a bad girl. I can't ask her, but I would love to read it. And what about you, Kiana?
So I have some historical projects that are going out on submission soon. One of them is a trilogy series, Regency set, um, that's historical mystery. Currently, I'm working on a manuscript that I have already contracted for Amazon Montlake Romance. It's a contemporary lesbian story that'll come out early in 2023.
Fantastic. So this has been so great speaking to you all. I wish we had more time. I always feel like, oh, how much are we going to be able to talk? And then it's like going and like going.
I know.
I
Yeah.
know. Unfortunately, we are all out of time, but I did just want to thank you all so much for this rich and insightful discussion. And Kianna and Sadeqa, thank you so much for writing these great books that highlight such important moments in our country's history. As a reminder to all you readers, Sadeqa's novel Yellow Wife is out in paperback now, and Kianna's book Carolina Built will be out at the end of this month, so be sure to grab a copy soon. Book Club Favorites will be back to discuss our February pick, Circus of Wonders, on March 2nd. So make sure you're in our Facebook group, on our newsletters, and just following us so you have all your updates with that. But thank you all again. This was such a great discussion, and I hope you all keep staying tuned with Simon & Schuster for more Black History Month celebrations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.